Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking about a trial that took place in China, in Beijing, at the end of 1980. It's become known as the trial of the Gang of Four. It was more than that, but it focused on four individuals, three men and a woman, who were accused of being responsible for the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution, and then, when Mao died in 1976, of trying to seize power for themselves. It is often viewed as the definitive show trial of the late 20th century. And in many ways it was, but it was so much more than that. In talking about the trial of the Gang of Four as a show trial, which I'm going to do, I'm aware I've used that phrase a lot in this series and never really defined what it means. And that's partly because it's actually really difficult to say what a show trial is, because it means lots of different things in different contexts. So, for instance, one way of trying to carve out the territory of the show trial is to say that show trials, unlike other kinds of trials that we might think of, are not really about trying to arrive at the truth. They're not about weighing the evidence. They're not about trying to reach some kind of judgment that hasn't been predetermined in advance, because in a show trial, the judgment is already known. The outcome is not a surprise. So the evidence, insofar as it's being looked at, is not there in order to explore what might or might not have happened. The evidence must be serving some other purpose. And the purpose is show. It is a demonstration of something, of power, of authority, of the ability of the regime, of those in charge, to establish the truth, to determine the facts, to get their verdict definitively established. But even if that's what you think a show trial is, the result is known in advance. There are lots of different ways that might play out, and there are lots of different things that might be thought to be being shown by the trial. So, for instance, the show trials that took place in Moscow in the 1930s that we discussed in this series, that is a particular kind of show trial, a familiar kind, in which what is being shown is really the power of the regime, the ability of those running the court behind the scenes to simply say what the truth is and get everyone to agree with it. It is tightly choreographed. Everybody plays their part. Everybody understands their part. And the part of the defendants is to comply completely, abjectly with what they are told. So there is that kind of show trial, almost as pure propaganda. But to take another trial where the outcome was foreordained, no one was in any doubt about the verdict that would be reached, and it was a trial that was routinely described in the press as a show trial, the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem. That wasn't simply, or even mainly, an assertion of power. It's true, the Israeli regime wanted to show that it could take a man like this, bring him to Israel, and put him on trial, and it was a way of establishing Israel's power in the world. But the purpose of the trial was much more educational or didactic than it was simply the pure propaganda of power. The people running that trial wanted to use it as a national and an international education in the truth of the Holocaust, what had happened. And so in that trial, a huge role was reserved for hearing testimony from victims, for hearing from the people who were at the receiving end of what was being judged, what indeed was being prejudged. So show trials can be didactic or educational as well as pure propaganda. And then to take another trial where the outcome was also known, no one was in any doubt that this man would be found guilty, Pétain, in the summer of 1945 in France. But the purpose of that trial, as well as being in some ways an exploration of what happened, it wasn't really to try and educate the French people about it, in part because there was a very queasy sense that no one was completely sure that story could be told in an educational way. There was too much complicity. Too many people had too complicated a relationship with the truth, including the people presiding over the trial. More, the purpose of that trial was to signal a transition to a new regime, a fresh start. Pétain was on trial to show that the Pétain era was over. And even though the story was complicated and many of the people involved in the trial were tied up in the thing that they were judging, some of them literally, the judges had been judges in the previous regime, still it was the case that the purpose of the trial was, to use a much more contemporary term, a kind of transitional justice, insofar as it was justice. The justice being established was that this was a new order and the old order was dead. It's also the case, as that trial illustrates, that even in cases where the outcome is never in doubt, no one believes that a verdict will come in which is anything other than guilty as charged. The sentence is sometimes in doubt. Even in a show trial, there can be quite a lot of uncertainty and indeed quite a lot of dispute and debate about the appropriate sentence should Pétain have been sentenced to death. The trial of Louis XVI, the trial of Charles I, the trial of Mary Queen of Scots. Those were all show trials, but the verdict, it happens in each case for execution, was nonetheless contentious and not foreordained. And then on top of all of that, there is the complication that the other kinds of trials, the ones where the verdict is not known, where there is some attempt to use the proceedings in court to work your way through the evidence, to weigh it up, maybe to be presented with two versions of the evidence and some group of people, judges, juries, being given the opportunity to reach a judgment about what they have heard. Even in those trials, there is an enormous amount of show, of performance. It is a spectacle. The courtroom is often a place of performance. Lawyers are one step up or one step down from actors. They play a part. No one expects them to be themselves. No one actually expects lawyers to tell the truth, in the sense that a lawyer does what the client requires. And so the lawyer puts on the best show that's possible. To take a case that I'm going to talk about in the next episode of this series, so just mention it briefly now, much more about this next time, but a definitive example of a trial in which the outcome really wasn't known in advance. We might think with hindsight in the case of O.J. Simpson that he was always going to get off, but that's not true, and the people involved in that trial were really uncertain right to the end. They had their instinctive views about what they thought might happen, and many of them were right. But no one knew what the jury was going to decide. And the whole trial was an attempt to get the jury to see it one way rather than another. So in that sense, by the definition I started with, that was not a show trial. But my God, it was a show. It was all performance, the acting of the lawyers, the theatricality of it, and the mere fact that in 1995, it was the TV event of the year. It was better than any soap opera. It was better than any drama. The drama in that courtroom, the suspense, the humour, the ridiculousness of much of what happened, the twists and turns, the farce, all of it was there in a show that was the greatest show on earth for many Americans, but also not, by my definition, a show trial. Even non-show trials can often be all about the show. And what makes the trial of the Gang of Four so interesting is that it was a show trial in all of the senses that I have just laid out. It was a version of all of those kinds of show trials. So, for instance, it was the TV event in China in late 1980, widely watched, closely followed, thought by many people to be astonishingly dramatic and surprising, caused a huge amount of discussion and comment. This is very, very early in Chinese terms in the era of television. So I'm not in this episode going to make any claims to be an expert about China. I'm really not. I'm basing this episode on things that I've read in English. I cannot speak the language, so this is all secondhand in that sense, translations and English language accounts. But it is the case that I have, at one point in my life, spent quite a lot of time in China. And it wasn't long after the trial of the Gang of Four. In 1985, I spent 6 months, in the year before I went to university, aged 18, traveling around China, independently around China. Very early in the Deng Xiaoping era, 4.5 years after the Gang of Four trial. And I have many memories of that time, but one of them is being struck by a couple of things, one of which was traveling around China, arriving in a new city, in a new town, and trying to understand how people got their news. The centrality of posters still, poster forms of communication, pieces of paper stuck up on walls. Often in town squares, people would gather to read newspapers, but also to read posters and to read government propaganda, and actually to read accounts of trials as well. One of the things I can still remember that made me feel very queasy was how often one would arrive in a new place and go to the centre of town and see people gathered around walls, places where information was literally put up. And this would often include photographs and reports, but I could only understand the photographs, of trials which had ended in execution. And there were pictures of the executions, or at least of the aftermath of the executions, on public display pretty much everywhere. And in that sense, China, to me, as a European visitor, a young, naive European visitor, felt very old-fashioned. I would now say, well, poster communication is more like what you might expect in a European city in the 19th century than the 20th century. But at the same time, I was also conscious in China in 1985 of how important TV had become, television, because there weren't that many TV sets in China. It was clear you didn't see them very often, but they were semi-public as well, in the sense that you might arrive in a town or a village, get to a bus stop, there would be some eating house nearby, a student dormitory, whatever, the kinds of places that I was able to see. And if there was a television set, there would be lots and lots of people gathered around. TV was very communal, and it was clearly increasingly important. And lots of people watched it. People gathered where the television set was. And they watched it and they talked as well. They would watch and talk and watch. So it was an interactive activity in the sense there was a lot of commentary, there was a lot of chat around what was being watched. And this certainly happened in the case of the trial of the Gang of Four. There is a lot of evidence that a lot of people saw some of the trial. It was filmed for TV every night on the news. Anyone who could get to a TV set would see a short extract from the Gang of Four trial, in the same way that the O.J. Simpson trial was the staple of the nightly news of America for a year. The Gang of Four trial was weeks, not months, but still, for those weeks, many tens of, one might even think hundreds of millions of people saw little glimpses of the trial, and the people who choreographed the trial were very conscious that it was a TV event. So it was the TV event in late 1980 in China, comparable to the O.J. Simpson trial. It was also a show trial in those other senses that I described. The result was not in doubt. I don't think there was anyone who thought that the defendants would get off, and they didn't. In some respects, it looked like a Moscow show trial. It had that feel to it. The defendants were cowed, most of them, but crucially not all, as we'll hear. They were frog-marched into the courtroom. They were placed in little pens where they were, or at least it looked like they were being humiliated. And they were certainly subject to pretty rough treatment. And they were expected to play a part. And the part that they were expected to play was to acquiesce in what was happening to them. And various clips from those trials look quite like the clips that are available of Moscow show trials. Those were filmed for newsreel. This was for TV, but the look is not that different. It was also a show trial in the didactic or educational sense. The point of the trial was to educate people, the Chinese people, not the wider world, I think, in this case, but the Chinese people, about the Cultural Revolution that had taken place in China from 1966 to 1976, and by 1980 was viewed by the regime as a disaster, as a catastrophe. And the catastrophe needed to be explained. And though many people in China were aware of many of the things that had happened, they hadn't been given a coherent story or account. Absolutely, they had not been given an explanation of how the regime under which they lived, and in some ways under which they still lived, could have been responsible for such an event. So these trials were to show that these people were responsible, and that involved explaining to people what they were responsible for. So the trials went on longer than they might otherwise have done, certainly if they had been like the Moscow show trials, where it It was just about getting the defendants to speak the words, to implicate and incriminate each other, and to do their jobs. In this case, a lot of time was spent hearing from victims, from witnesses. There was a lot of witness evidence about what had happened in those years. Terrible stories of violence and murder and chaos as well. And much of the trial was taken up with that, as in the case of Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. Much of the trial was evidence from witnesses who were themselves victims, some of it tangential to the charges directly levelled at Eichmann, except insofar as Eichmann was held to be responsible for all of it. Same in this case. There were specific charges against the defendants, but they were also more broadly charged with just being responsible for the disaster. But it was also that kind of show trial that the trial of Pétain was, to signal transition from one regime to another, to signal that the Cultural Revolution was over, but not just that, and not just that the people in charge were now out, but a new way of doing politics, of doing rule in China was underway. This was very early in the Deng Xiaoping period. After the Cultural Revolution in 1976 and Mao's death towards the end of that year, there had been an interim period, and this was at the tail end of the interim period and just at the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping period. But in between, a man called Hua Guofeng had been in charge, who was a sort of hybrid figure, not quite the old, not quite the new. The reason there was a 4-year gap from 76 to 80 is by 1980, Deng Xiaoping had asserted himself and his supporters were now running the show. And this was their show trial. Hua Guofeng was on the way out and the new era was beginning. And this would symbolize that. It was also one of those show trials in which, though the verdict was known, the sentence was not known. And there was some contention, some uncertainty as to whether any of the defendants would be sentenced to death. If so, which of them? And if they were, would the sentence be carried out? Very like the case of Pétain. So it was a show trial, but it was also a very complicated, multi-layered event. There were lots of different things going on in this trial, not least because though it's known as the Gang of Four trial, there were not just 4 defendants. There were 10 defendants that came in 3 groups. 5 of them were former military men, by this point many of them pretty old, who were being charged with their involvement in an assassination attempt against Mao and a general plot or attempted coup against Mao that ran from roughly 1970 to 1971. So in the middle part of the Cultural Revolution, these men were accused of trying to overthrow the regime, essentially by trying to have Mao killed. And the leader of that little group, a man called Lin Biao, was dead. He wasn't on trial because, actually, he had died, as they say, in suspicious circumstances. A plane crash, no one quite knew who was responsible for it. But this was the Lin Biao faction, leading army officers charged with crimes from roughly a decade ago in this trial. There was also a man called Chen Boda, who'd been very close to Mao, a kind of secretary, speechwriter, an affiliate of Mao. He'd also been an affiliate of Lin Biao, and he was charged in connection with that earlier phase with having tried to assert himself and to co-opt power to himself during the middle period of the Cultural Revolution. And then there were the 4, the Gang of Four, whose crimes were thought to have come later. They were charged both with the excesses of the revolution, the violence, the death, on a huge scale, so on the charge sheet against them. And I think there were 48 charges in total for the various defendants in this trial. The charge sheet against them accused them of being responsible for the persecution of up to 700,000 people and being responsible for 35,000 deaths. They were also much more specifically charged with trying to take power in a coup after Mao's death at the end of 1976. The 4 who made up the Gang of Four were Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, Jiang Qing, and Jiang Qing. The last, the only woman on trial, the only female defendant of the 10, and also Mao's widow. In the Western press, somehow conventionally known as Madame Mao. The four were charged with crimes committed in the later period of the Cultural Revolution and then after it was effectively over in 76. The others with crimes from a very different period and very different kinds of crimes. The complication here is that one of these groups was charged with trying to overthrow the regime. The other of these groups was both charged with trying to overthrow the regime at the end of 1976, but also of the worst excesses of the regime, which raised the question, were the Gang of Four, like the others, simply plotters, conspirators, the enemy within? Or were they being singled out because they were in some ways symbolic of something that had gone wrong with the regime itself? And that question, were they inside or outside the regime which was now coming to judge them, was at the heart of the ambivalence of this trial. The other thing that makes it really interesting is if you just take those four, the four known as the Gang of Four, they all behaved very differently during the trial. In a classic Moscow show trial, the defendants all behaved the same way. They all did what was required of them. Many of them had clearly been the victims of torture. They were all subject to terrible threats about what might happen to their families if they didn't go along. And so they all followed the script, denounced each other, were abject in their contrition and their sense of guilt. They described themselves, as the court described them, as dogs, as the lowest of the low. In other show trials, such as the Eichmann trial, the defendant did not behave in that way. Eichmann was not completely submissive or abject. He was nitpicking and irritating and touchy in various ways, and at some points quite subservient to the court, and at other points standing on his dignity. God knows what dignity he thought he had, but he wanted to maintain some sense of himself as a man with rights in this process. Some of them, like Pétain, were more than that. In show trials, sometimes the defendant really tries to push back against the evidence, to question it, to challenge it, to defy it. In this trial, one of the defendants, the youngest of them, Wang Hongwen, who had been at the heart of the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai as a young man, had helped to instigate it, and then had got swept up within the Chinese Communist Party to the very top, and in that role had become part of this gang who then, at the end of the revolution, tried to seize power for itself. He was completely abject. He played his part like he was in Moscow in 1936. Everything that was put to him, he agreed with. He was as self-lacerating as any prosecutor could want. He hung his head in shame. Yao Wenyuan, who alongside Jiang Qing was one of the two members of the Gang of Four who'd started out as a journalist, a writer, a propagandist who had come to the attention of Mao in the mid-1960s by writing articles suggesting that the country maybe was on the wrong track because it was being infiltrated with the wrong ideas. The old ideas were coming back, and there was a need for a new wave of culture, a culture that was appropriate to the revolution. The revolution had to be renewed. Yao Wenyuan and Jiang Qing were writers who became politicians and ended up on the Politburo and then ended up as members of the Gang of Four. Yao tried to mount a defense, but it was effectively a kind of legal defense in that he questioned witnesses, and these defendants were given defense lawyers. So by Western standards, this was not a particularly fair trial, and there were many complaints that the defendants weren't given any opportunity to examine the evidence that would be presented against them beforehand. They were railroaded into the process. All of the advantages were with the prosecution. They had very few rights in the court, but they did have some. They could question witnesses, or their lawyers could, and they could challenge the version of events that was being presented. And Yao did try to challenge the version of events, but in a fairly nitpicking way, slightly Eichmann-esque way. This isn't true, that's not true, I couldn't have been there. Not the overall picture, but still, he wasn't willing to accept the details. Jiang simply remained silent throughout. He said nothing. He didn't reject the authority of the court. He didn't accept the authority of the court. He more or less absented himself from proceedings. He was physically there. He was sat there or stood there. They had to stand at various points. But he did not take part. And then Jiang Qing, Mao's widow, was, unlike any of the people I've talked about in any of the show trials that I've described in this series, not just resistant to the authority of the court, not just defiant, but completely and utterly contemptuous of everything that was happening. And she signaled that contempt not by silence, but by screams of disdain, by vicious attacks, not simply on the presiding judge, but on witnesses. She screamed at witnesses as they were recounting their terrible stories of the appalling things that had happened to them and their family in the violent excesses of the revolution. Jiang Qing screamed at them, "Traitors! You're traitors! How do you let these scum in here to tell their filthy lies?" She screamed abuse at the presiding judge. At one point, she had to be dragged out of the court, more or less, kicking and screaming. She was completely defiant. So 4 versions of a defendant in a show trial that had multiple different dimensions to it. And then at the heart of all of the complexity of this trial, the question that almost everyone recognized that the trial was both trying to answer and trying to avoid and unable to answer was the role of Mao Zedong, the man that Jiang Qing had been married to, who had been dead for 4 years, in whose name the Cultural Revolution had taken place, who had instigated the Cultural Revolution, who was the driving force behind the Cultural Revolution. Was he on trial here too? Was this the kind of trial that was signaling regime change from Mao to something else? If so, that was a pretty risky strategy because Mao was the revolution, and the regime in place in 1980 was nothing without the revolution. It was still not just the Chinese Communist Party, but this was still the people whose legitimacy was entirely derived from the revolution. But if this trial was not signaling distance from Mao, then there was something to his widow's defiance, because one of the things that she said repeatedly to the court is, "I was doing Mao's bidding." At one point she said, "I was Mao's dog." She called herself a dog, not in the sense of being an abject creature, but of being a loyal servant of the regime. When he said, "Bite, I bit," she told the court. "I was doing Mao's bidding. What were you doing?" A question they could not answer. Because if the answer was, "We were doing Mao's bidding too," why are you different from me? Why am I different from you? And if the answer is, "We don't do Mao's bidding," then she would say to them, "You are traitors. You are all traitors." At the time of the trial, there was I don't think the word for this is a joke, but there was a kind of commentary on proceedings that ordinary Chinese people watching it on television would use to each other to signal their sense of what was going on, which is a hand gesture that was made. I'm making it now. I'm holding my hand in front of me. You hold up 4 fingers straight, and then you just wiggle your thumb. And that was the gesture that Chinese people would make to each other during the trial. And it could mean lots of different things. But the 4 fingers, the Gang of 4, upright, visible, rigid. And the wiggling thumb is Mao. The implication being Mao's role in this is very uncertain, or there's something going on here which is not fixed and is not rigid, or potentially just this isn't what it seems. Hold your hand up, put your fingers up, wiggle your thumb. It suggests something isn't quite right here. So that was the challenge for the court. How simultaneously to signal that the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. These people were responsible for it. These people were doing Mao's bidding. We are still in some ways doing Mao's bidding because the regime was clear it couldn't break from Mao. This was not, for instance, like Khrushchev in 1956, trying to signal a break from Stalin and Stalinism. The one thing that was not denounced in this trial was Maoism. Indeed, the people behind the trial wanted to uphold Maoism as the basis of the revolution. And so they needed a way of framing the whole procedure so that it could perform its function of assigning guilt. And it was assigning guilt, among other things, to a woman who had been married to Mao for 38 years. She was closer to him than anyone. And when she said, "I did what he told me to do," it was hard to say that that was a lie. The court wished to assign guilt to these people, to use them to signal that wrongs were being righted, that there was accountability, that there was a new start, and at the same time, not to cut Mao loose. And in the end, there were two strategies devised to allow this to happen in the trial, and beyond the trial as well. The trial is a symbol of this. This was the strategy of the regime. Two sets of distinctions had to be made. The first was a distinction between crimes and errors. So was the Cultural Revolution a crime, or was it an error, a mistake? The answer, according to the court, is that it was both. But the people who were sitting in front of them, in front of the judges, the 10 defendants, were guilty of crimes. They may have been guilty of errors too. It's hard to understand how you could commit a crime without also being wrong about your understanding of the revolution. But these were the criminals. This was not an attempt to pull before the court everyone who had committed an error, because that would be an absurdity. By implication, many millions of people had committed errors during the Cultural Revolution. They had misunderstood. They had got the wrong end of the stick. They had not fully grasped the nature of the political truths that underpinned the regime. They had deviated from them. But these people weren't merely deviators. They were criminals. And then the second distinction that had to be upheld was between Mao himself, the man, and what was called Mao Zedong thought. We might call it Maoism, but I think it's something more specific than that. Mao Zedong thought, which was a doctrine, but it was also crucially an understanding of the revolution. Mao Zedong thought was still the basis of the regime, and the leading lights in the regime, including Deng Xiaoping, did not repudiate Mao Zedong thought. At the heart of Mao Zedong thought was the idea, the Marxist idea, that the revolution was a manifestation of the objective material forces at work in society. The class struggle was an objective fact, and history was an objective process. It was moving in a particular direction. It had a logic to it, and the revolution was the expression of that logic. And the completion of the revolution, the pursuit of communism, was also an expression of that objective truth. So underlying the revolution was the truth of history. And the truth of history is that history is a class struggle in which one class, the proletariat, will by definition come out on top. And its representatives, its manifestation at the level of the state, will be the organizing principle of politics and power in the post-revolutionary society. It was, in many ways, orthodox Marxism, though adapted for a Chinese setting, so it had many Chinese elements to it, but its key claim was to scientific objectivity based on a correct reading of history. That was Mao Zedong thought, and neither the trial nor the regime that lay behind the trial wanted to reject it. Mao was not Mao Zedong thought. Mao Zedong thought was scientific truth. Mao Zedong happened to be the person who had put his name to it. Mao himself was a human being, and like all human beings, he was fallible. He was capable of committing errors. That's how these two distinctions went together. And towards the end of his life, the assumption was that Mao had not committed crimes, not like the woman he was married to, who had committed an obvious crime in late 1976. She had tried to mount a coup against the regime. She tried to seize power for herself and for her clique. She was a power-hungry, power-crazed criminal. Mao wasn't. Mao was power. But he made mistakes towards the end of his life as he got older, as he got sicker, and of course he was surrounded by criminals, people who are now being established as criminals, the Gang of Four. So this increasingly vulnerable old man was at the mercy of people who were criminals. That did not make him a criminal. In many ways, it made him a victim. The court didn't quite go so far as to say that Mao was a victim of the Cultural Revolution, but it did want to say that the man had to be separated from the thought. And so these two distinctions were the organizing principles of the trial. The trial had to demonstrate two things. First of all, the difference between crimes and errors. And secondly, the fact that though the Cultural Revolution was a catastrophe, and a catastrophe within which many crimes were committed, understood as an error, it was possible to say that Mao was in part responsible because he made a mistake, but that did not invalidate Mao Zedong thought, because the only way to understand the nature of the mistake is through Mao Zedong thought. In other words, the objective truth of history shows that the Cultural Revolution was an error, because the Cultural Revolution was an attempt to seize control of history and take it in the wrong direction. And if a word had to be used to sum up what that direction was, it was in the direction of a new culture. A new set of ideas were unleashed, the ideas of the young, the ideas of the radicals, the ideas of the people who wanted immediate justice and retribution, all of the chaos of the revolution, as anyone represented with any form of the old in China was dragged out, humiliated, and in many cases killed. That was a mistake because it was not objective. It was not history. It was individuals and groups of individuals asserting themselves on top of, in the face of history, and dragging it in the wrong direction. And Mao was one of those people. Mao made the mistake of thinking that what China needed in 1966 and for the rest of that decade was a new broom. At the end of his life, Mao said the two things he was proudest of was defeating the Japanese and defeating the nationalist regime, that is, the revolution itself and its success in getting established, and the Cultural Revolution, because the revolution had needed to be renewed in 1966. It needed new ideas. It needed fresh faces and fresh thinking. New people had to come in and reboot it, re-energize it. And from the perspective of the regime that was in place in 1980, what would become the Deng Xiaoping regime, that was a mistake. History does not need re-energizing and rebooting. History needs to be allowed to follow its preordained course to justice. So the trial established these two truths in various ways. One was simply to be a trial, to have these people in the dock. It was a semi-westernized, somewhat Western-influenced event. The presence of defense lawyers, very unusual in a Chinese court. The examination of witnesses, the way that the evidence was presented to Western audiences who saw it on TV themselves, translated and then on their own news shows. It looked both familiar and unfamiliar. It did look like a courtroom and a trial, and the procedures looked like recognizable legal procedures. At the same time, it looked like an entirely set up, fixed event. And it was in many ways those two things simultaneously, but to a Chinese audience, the legalistic aspects of the case were much more unusual and much more symbolic. Criminals, witnesses, victims, the victim testimony, the extent of it, to establish that these people did these wrongs, these specific wrongs. Not just they were wrong, they were on the wrong side of history, but these people, their families, their dead parents, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, children, were the victims of these criminals. 700,000 people, 35,000 people, and also, crucially, at the heart of the trial, two events: an attempted assassination plot against Mao and an attempted coup at the beginning of the 70s, and then after Mao's death, another attempted coup, takeover of the state in late 1976. Clearly not errors. An assassination attempt is not an error. A coup is not an error. A coup is a crime. So the criminalization of those in the docks was a crucial part of this, to make that distinction. But then the other thing that the trial was designed to do was in itself to correct the error of the Cultural Revolution. So as well as identifying the criminals, it also tried to establish that under the terms of the new regime, there would be a new way of dealing with these kinds of events, which was dispassionate, rational, procedural. This was a court of law with rules. Some of the rules had been made up for this case. Still, it was a highly formal event. So unlike, say, the Moscow show trials, where in a way the formality was in the extraordinary repetitiveness of the script, the way in which everything that everyone said seemed to have been scripted beforehand. But the courtroom itself was a joke. The idea that due process was being followed, that there were rules outside of the court that shaped what happened in the court. Everything in the Moscow show trials that happened in the room was shaped by the power dynamics in the room. In the case of the trial of the Gang of Four, there was a serious attempt made to show that this was a new way of doing justice. It would be formal, it would be rational, there would be rules. Everyone in the room was subject to rules. They were not at the mercy of the whims of the prosecutors or the judges. It was not all about confession. It was about following the rules. And this was in clear and obvious contrast to what had happened during the Cultural Revolution, when there had been effectively no rules. Personal power dynamics were everything. Not just the Gang of Four and the people at the top, but right the way through Chinese societies, people found themselves at the mercy of other individuals and their ideas of who was good, who was bad, who needed to be purged, who needed to be rescued, who could be saved and who was damned. All of that was played out through interpersonal power dynamics on a wild scale, a terrifying scale, everywhere. No one was safe because at any point, the violence of personal power politics might erupt. And this was designed to symbolize the opposite of that. No one in that room was going to assert their personal power. Justice would be seen to be done, and one of the reasons all trials are show trials is because justice can't just be done, it has to be seen to be done. In this case, it would be seen to be done through process, through procedure. And that was how this trial was meant to work. And in some ways, I think it succeeded. Many Chinese people were very struck by how formal the proceedings were, and actually some of the courtesies that were shown to the defendants. They were given an opportunity to question. They did have legal representation. Though they were paraded in many ways before the court, though they were at various points humiliated by the court, that was taken for granted. Chinese justice had those elements in it. It was familiar. The unfamiliar bit were the semi-westernized bits. So in some ways, it did signal that transition. It was a correction of error. But in a couple of respects, it still remained a deeply ambivalent event, one in which there was always more than one thing going on. And I just want to illustrate that in a couple of ways. So most strikingly, there is the question of how to interpret the behavior of Jiang Qing, Mao's widow, in her defiance. I say no one in that room was trying to assert personal power politics. Well, with one exception, she was. She was all about her personal aura, her claim as the widow of the man that no one had disowned, the man who still was the revolution, her claim to be untouchable by that court. They had no right to judge her. In judging her, they were showing themselves to be the renegades and the traitors. But it wasn't just what she said, it was her manner. She was so disdainful of everything that was happening around her from the beginning to the end. And it is worth watching clips from the trial of her being brought in, being taken out, sitting or standing, confronting the man who was presiding over the body of judges. There were a large number of judges sitting in this case. And one of its distinctive features is that the judges, the lay judges, not people with a training in law, but people who were there to represent different elements of society, were drawn from the groups who were the victims of the revolution. So though this was meant to be a formal and objective process, no one had any compunction about the idea that the people sitting in judgment were themselves victims, which was actually also true of the Pétain trial, putting members of the resistance on the jury. Something similar happened in this case. But the way she spoke, looked at the man who presided over that body of judges, it is worth seeing it We'll include clips in our newsletter if you'd like to look at them there, but they're widely available if you just look up videos of the Gang of Four trial. And the question is, in behaving in that way, was she subverting the authority of the court? Was she going against what the trial was trying to show by rejecting out of hand everything that was happening to her? Or was she playing her part? Was that what the trial wanted and needed? Was she in some ways complicit in this process, in her defiance? And certainly the propaganda around the trial at the time, the way it was written up in Chinese newspapers, in the People's Daily, and the kinds of things that would be posted up on those poster boards in villages, towns, and cities, said of Jiang Qing that she was absolutely everything that the court said she was in her behavior. So she had been an actress. She was notorious for having been an actress. And though she had been married to Mao for nearly 4 decades, it is worth remembering she was his 4th wife and he was her 3rd husband. Both of them in the first half of their lives had had a pretty chaotic set of marital experiences. In Mao's case, twice widowed, once divorced. In Jiang's case, twice divorced before she met Mao. But she was best known as an actress. And the reports of the trial just said she is what we always knew she was. She is an actress. She is a performer. She is a woman of astonishing narcissism and vanity. And if you watch her in the trial, she certainly comes across as someone who is, one, putting on a performance or a show. Everything that she does feels choreographed, not by the court, but by her, in defiance of the court. And yet, weirdly, in defying the court, she is making the court's point for it. If she symbolizes the regime that is out now, the one that corrupted Mao Zedong thought, and then committed terrible crimes, and then tried to seize power, and had been jailed, it should be said. All of these people had been in jail for many, many years, and the ones who were silent or abject or contrite had been broken, no question. But she hadn't been broken by her 4 years in jail. But her defiance was an assertion of her personality. Her personality throbs through her performance. And that is precisely the thing that the trial was designed to signal was the way of doing justice that no longer applied. This was no longer a world of throbbing, personal power politics expressed in law. She was trying to do it the old way, shrieking Mao's name, calling down all sorts of threats on the court, telling the court, don't you know who I am? Don't you know who I am? She was the living embodiment of the errors as well as the crimes of the Cultural Revolution. The idea that one individual could scream justice and do it in such a extravagant, theatrical way that a whole world is convulsed. She was the thing that the court was there to condemn. And yet, weirdly, when you watch it, there's also a feeling that she is a real threat to the court. So as well as completely playing her part, made it easy for the people presiding to say, this is exactly what we're talking about. As she was dragged out, more or less kicking and screaming, they were able to say, told you so. This is precisely what we are trying to purge from our society, this way of doing it. They also looked very uncomfortable. They were very uncomfortable when she said to them, I did Mao's bidding. What did you do? Who do you think you are? What is the basis for your authority? Where does your legitimacy come from? Mao or not Mao? That's the question. There is no other question. Mao or not Mao? If you answer Mao, why am I in the dock? If you answer not Mao, why are you sitting in judgment over me? You cannot answer my question. It wasn't just that her performance conformed with the choreography of the trial, it also severely undermined it. And even in those moments where she's physically coerced out of the courtroom, it both feels like the court is establishing its authority, those days are over, and is very, very uncertain of its authority. It can't even bear for her to remain in the room. She has to be removed. She is a real threat. She remains a real threat. And her performance is completely mesmerizing, even watched at this distance. And it has so many layers to it. It's very hard to know which one is the true one. And then the other deep ambivalence running through the whole case is the fact that Everything that the trial was there to symbolize about what was now new, the way in which the regime was going to operate differently. It was going to allow due process and procedure. There would be a legalistic framework for the way in which it dealt with, among other things, its enemies. This wouldn't be arbitrary justice. This wouldn't be personal justice. This wouldn't be the justice that belonged to the person who could shriek loudest or claim the greatest ideological purity. This would be procedural justice. But the irony of that is that it was being done in the name of Mao Zedong thought. It was being said that in order to get back to the objective truths of the revolution, we are going to have a more objective scheme of justice, something more formal and rational, less personal, less corruptible. But it is being done in the name of the iron laws of history. It is being done in the name not of the pure objectivity of a good legal process, but of the fact that a good legal process is a better fit with the objective direction of travel of history, which is towards the justice, the truth of the proletarian revolution and the society that will be built off the back of that. In other words, this was not the rule of law for the sake of the rule of law. This was the rule of law for the sake of the revolution, which was both the opposite of the Cultural Revolution and a version of what the Cultural Revolution thought that it was. It's just in this case, this is the legal revolution, not the Cultural Revolution. So it's law, not culture, process, not ideas, objectivity, not who can shout loudest. But still, Mao and the people around him in 1965-66, at the birth of the Cultural Revolution, thought they were doing what Deng and the people around him thought they were doing in 1980, which is getting the revolution back on track. In 65-66, Mao and the people around him thought that the threat came from people who were dragging in old ideas. And so what was needed were clear new ideas unleashed to re-energize the revolution. In 1980, the fear was that what was threatening the revolution was still the lingering hold of that Cultural Revolution and those new ideas. Ideas of the extreme left, one might say. In 66, the fear was the ideas of the right. And they were called, these respective groups, left deviationists, the Gang of Four, right deviationists, the people who were the enemies in the Cultural Revolution, deviating from the iron laws of history. Law, culture, but what they were attempting was the same: get the revolution back on track, which meant that there was a kind of lie at the heart of the lesson of the trial of the Gang of Four. This was not China now a rule of law state, China now a state in which justice could be seen to be done because procedure was all. Procedure was still window dressing. This was still a show trial in that sense. The procedure was real and processes were followed, and indeed, those defendants, including Jiang Qing, who were sentenced to death, had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. She eventually committed suicide in prison, defiant to the end. So it's not like the procedures were empty or hollow as they were in the Moscow show trials. This was not a farce. There was nothing farcical about the Gang of Four trial. It was deadly serious. But this was also not the birth of a rule of law state. The rule of law was still subject to the objective requirements of the regime. The regime itself was not subject to the rule of law. Criminals would be. Criminals like the Gang of Four, like the deviationists who had committed crimes. But the regime had the rule of law as one of the tools in its armory, one of its instruments. It was not the case that the rule of law was the overarching framework within which and through which the regime would be judged. That was true in 1980. It remains true in China to this day. It is not a rule of law state. There may be no rule of law states in the world. Every state has its exceptions from the rule of law. But in the case of the Chinese state, the pattern that was established in 1980 held, which is there would be much more process. There would be much more of the trappings of a legal state. The Cultural Revolution would never be repeated. The mistakes of the Cultural Revolution would never be repeated. But law was an instrument of state. The state was not something that could be judged by the terms of law, because underneath it all is Mao Zedong thought. And Mao Zedong thought says that the ultimate arbiter of truth is history, and the regime is the manifestation of the truth of history. So nothing and nobody can gainsay the truth of the regime. That was the state that was established in 1980 and beyond. And this trial, in some ways, perfectly symbolizes that transition from the Cultural Revolution, its crimes and its errors, to a new regime in which China would open up. People like me could travel there in 1985. There weren't many of us, but now a society that is in various ways very open to the world, extraordinarily powerful, remarkably prosperous, certainly relative to what it was in 1980 or 1985 or 1995 or 2005 or 2015, getting richer and more powerful all the time, with many of the trappings of a society based on law. But law still serves the state. The state is not itself subject to law, because the state is subject to the laws, the objective laws of history. And this extraordinary trial in 1980, with all of its different levels and dimensions, all of the different things that were going on simultaneously, all of the different ways it could be read, the wiggling thumb on the hand of the four fingers. What does that wiggling thumb mean? Where is it in Chinese society? This trial perfectly captures that transition, not from arbitrary rule to the rule of law, but from one way of making sense of the revolution to another. It should be said, the other, the new way, has been remarkably successful, but it is still, as it was in 1980, connected to the thing that came before. In all of these ways, this show trial was the perfect show for that moment of change. We're coming to the end of this series, Politics on Trial, which has been going on for a long time, and we've had an enormous amount of messages, lots and lots of people getting in touch about lots of different things, often correcting me on my pronunciations, I am sure, after today's episode. There'll be a few of those, but also making suggestions for trials that we could cover. And a lot of the trials that I've done recently were ones that were suggested by listeners, including the Muhammad Ali trial. We're incredibly grateful for all your messages. We do, I promise you, read all of them, because we really are a very tiny team. We don't get the chance to reply to every message we get, but we appreciate them all and we read them all. So thank you. Do keep them coming in, not just pronunciation corrections. Next time in Politics on Trial, the trial that I mentioned at the beginning there, I'm not going to say it's the other half of this story. The O.J. Simpson trial and the Gang of Four trial really don't have much in common with each other, except this. As with the Gang of Four trial, the O.J. Simpson trial, looked back with hindsight now, seems like it was the perfect show to usher in a new world, the world that we still inhabit. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.